Let's just rip this band-aid off right here at the start of the video. I am not the biggest fan of the Minish Cap. I'm hesitant to call it overrated, since that word is generally used by pompous losers who think their opinions are somehow more valid than anyone else's, but there comes a point with how much love is showered towards this game that I don't really feel towards it. That's the first word that comes to mind, a very similar feeling that I have towards the Galaxy games. I'm not gonna pretend that I don't enjoy the game, it's just that I don't enjoy every aspect of the game. And even the aspects of the game that I do enjoy aren't as strong as other entries in the series. Not helping this feeling is the fact that the incredible Oracle games that were not only made by Capcom, but also directed by Hidemaru Fujibayashi, also known as the director of Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom, and a sub-director and story writer for Phantom Hourglass. And just to really light the pitchforks against me, this is his worst Zelda game by far, both in terms of story and gameplay. And I know that this video predates Tears of the Kingdom by a few weeks, but somehow I doubt that the direct sequel to one of my favorite games ever made will be on the same level as the Minish Cap. I have immense respect for Fujibayashi. He was in charge of some truly phenomenal games, both before this game and after. Plus, I don't even think that Minish Cap is even that bad. It's in the lower half of the Zelda tier list for sure, but even then it would be incredibly petty for me to call it anything less than a perfectly fine game with some really cool ideas. In fact, there's a thesis statement for the video, which I should probably put in these videos more often, but that requires effort. Enough rambling though, let's light the flames on this pyre that I will be tied to shortly as I begin this Minish Cap retrospective. The Minish Cap is a pretty good looking GBA game. As a 2D pixel art adaptation of the Toon style, I think it turned out pretty good. To be honest, talking about graphics has never really been my strong suit. It's not like I can talk about what makes every individual pixel look appealing or disgusting, and then go on a tirade about dithering and whatnot, so let's move on to the music. It's definitely a step up from the Oracle games. Granted, I do still think that it's one of the lower tier soundtracks in the series, but there are still some pretty good tracks here. I like tracks like Minish Village, Hyrule Town, they're decent little pieces of background music. And the Sound of Droplets is easily the best dungeon track from the game, being wonderfully atmospheric. There are two tracks that I absolutely adore though, being Dark Hyrule Castle, which is a fantastic remix of the original tune from A Link to the Past, with this really cool pitch bend down to the different notes on the synth that I just can't get enough of. And my favorite piece of music in the game, Minish Woods, which is one of my favorite pieces of music in the entire series. It's just phenomenal. It's catchy, playful, and captures the environment pretty well. Outside of these tracks though, the simplest way that I can put it is that this game's music just doesn't really grab me in the same way as the best the series has to offer, you know? The same could be said for the game's story, especially in regards to the main antagonist, Vaati. In order to explain the main issue that I have with the game's plot, I first need to do a basic explanation of an important element of the Zelda series. The Triforce is a sacred object that was formed at the point that the three goddesses left Hyrule after having created the world. Entire wars were fought over it, and the people's lust for power using it led to entire tribes being banished into the Shadow Realm. Why do so many want to find the Triforce? Because when complete, it grants the wish of whoever touches it. Got all that? So the main conflict of this game starts when Ezio creates a hat that grants wishes. God dang it. Look, we could argue all day as to whether or not the Zelda team actually cares about the overarching story of the Zelda games, which I have evidence that they do, but the Triforce granting a wish has been a main feature and staple of the lore since at least A Link to the Past. It is used as an important plot point in that game to reverse the damage done by Ganon in that game. It's used in the Wind Waker to secure a future for the next generation, specifically in regards to Link and Tetra. It's used in Skyward Sword to destroy Demise in the present day. It's used in A Link Between Worlds to restore Lorel's Triforce, and obtaining it is typically Ganon/Ganondorf's main goal. So pardon me for thinking that a character just casually creating a hat that is better than the most powerful object in the entire world, since it can grant multiple wishes rather than just one, is a little absurd. Equally as absurd are the motivations of Vaati. He's the second most recurring villain in the series behind Ganon, and personally I think he kinda sucks, mainly when it comes to why he becomes a villain in the first place. I often hear people say that a story is only as good as its villain, which is then used to criticize shallow and lame antagonists as some petty way to cripple a story. I don't agree with this statement. Personally, I think that the protagonist, who we actually follow throughout the story, should be the one who gets more focus and is fleshed out more, with more interesting motivations in comparison to the villain. Not that it has to be rich and complex, just something that makes them fully realized in the world. So long as the villain's motivation is more than just being evil for the sake of being evil, which makes them at least 10 times less interesting, I don't really care. That's not to say there aren't moments where this approach works, like if it's a comedy film, or if there's another antagonist that isn't written that way to round things out and make sure that there's an actual threat for the main character. All this to say that Vaati kind of fails as a villain for me. His main motivations when he becomes evil are fine. He wants to find the light force and you gotta stop him. Nothing amazing, but nothing bad either. Why the hat that grants wishes can't find it for him or give it to him is beyond me, but maybe he's just low on brain cells or something. The bigger problem that I have with Vaati is his motivations for becoming evil in the first place. The game explains that he became enchanted by the wickedness of the hearts of men, which to me sounds like he thought that men being evil was pretty poggers, and that if he became evil then he would become based. Because no other explanation makes any sense. Ganondorf is evil because he was angry that the rest of Hyrule was able to prosper except for his people, and he wanted to take over the kingdom in order to have that prosperity for himself. Majora is also evil for the sake of being evil, but the story makes up for that with its main motivation being that it finds the suffering and pain of others a fun game. Majora is also way more sinister since we see how threatening it is through the entire game, since every single problem stems from that. Vaati is just too underwritten for me to really feel anything other than annoyance in regards to him, which wouldn't be too much of an issue if 90% of the story didn't focus on him. None of the characters here are really that interesting either, other than Ezlo. He's fun, though outside of his amusing dialogue, I don't really think there's that much to him, which is especially disappointing given that the entire conflict revolves around his relationship with Vaati, which is never explored. Twilight Princess was about the relationship between Zant and Midna, and even though it wasn't explored that much, it is enough to the point that I can understand why the conflict in that game happens. Bottom line is I like Ezlo, but Mario did the whole talking hat thing better, so Odyssey better than Minish Cap plus ratio. While I could talk about this stuff a little bit more, at this point I want to get into what I really don't like about the game, rather than just focusing on the superfluous fluff. So let's get into easily the worst part of the game. The Kinstone system and Mysterious Shells not only suck, but they actually ruin the entire game for me. A bold statement that is sure to get all who watch this video to click off, but I promise you that I am not exaggerating here. In order to get into why they sour the game, I first need to explain how they work and the inherent problems with both systems on an individual level before we see how it bleeds over into the rest of the experience. Throughout the world, you can find a variety of kinstone pieces, mostly dropped by enemies or found in grass. Green kinstones are the most common and lead to the least interesting rewards. Blue kinstones are a bit rarer and are mostly used for side quests. And then red kinstones are the rarest and lead to the most interesting rewards, like cart pieces. On paper, it sounds like a decent idea, encouraging players to interact with NPCs, which will unlock other areas of the world, like vines disappearing, or in one of the more interesting fuses in the game, another Goron will be added to help take down this wall. That's pretty much all the nice things that I can say about the system. I really do hate it that much. Problem number 1! RNG. Every Kinstone fusion has a different shape, and outside of the pieces that are found in chests, there's no guarantee that the piece that you found will match with an NPC that you want to fuse with, which inevitably means that you need to go out and kill a bunch of enemies and mow all the lawns of Hyrule just for the hope that you get the stupid piece that you need. To be a little fair, there is a mini game that helps you grind to find the right piece, which speeds it up somewhat. Don't really know why they didn't just have there only be 100 pieces in the world instead of adding a dumb RNG element to it for literally no reason though. It takes too long to fuse. There are 100 different fusions in the game, and there's no way of telling what fusion you'll need to make with an NPC until you get to the fusion screen. And by then, a slight version of the sunk cost fallacy kicks in, and since you've already wasted this much time by talking to them, you might as well fuse with them. It's not a huge deal. Fact of the matter is though, that with 100 different fusions in the game, you'll never know what fusion you'll need to make, with the only hint as to what you need to do being either a thought bubble of a rupee or a heart over the NPC's head. There will never be a guarantee that you'll even have the right piece, inevitably forcing you on this stupid Easter egg hunt for a single fusion that happens at multiple points in the game if you aren't using a guide, which ultimately feeds into the first problem. On top of this, some NPCs even have multiple fusions that you can only access one at a time, so you'll never know if an NPC has multiple fusions unless you leave the screen and then come back, which makes it take even longer. Especially when they hide a major reward fusion behind a lame reward fusion, just to really rub salt in the wound. On top of all this, there's no in-game way of tracking which NPC has which kinstone, meaning that you just have to remember them. All rewards are locked behind this stupid system. The vast majority of the time when you fuse with someone, it will open up an area that you will need to then travel to. Unlike literally every other Zelda game which opens up the world with new items that you get, this one opens up with this incredibly dumb system. What benefit to the game overall does locking secrets and rewards behind these kinstones really do? Why can't you just burn these vines down to access the cave? Why can't I just use the Pegasus boots to cross the water? Why do I have to fuse a Kinstone to add a Goron to the workforce instead of just going into the world and finding a Goron and sending him to join the others? While it could be argued that the Kinstone system encourages exploration, my rebuttal to this is that the only thing it ends up accomplishing is sucking all the fun out of that exploration. What about any fusion in the entire game shows how it meaningfully upgrades the process of exploring the world? I just can't wrap my head around it. But don't worry, there is something else that you can find other than Kinstones, that being the Mysterious Shells. Much like Kinstones, they're found as RNG drops as well as in chests throughout the world. Their purpose is to collect figures, essentially acting as a form of currency specifically for these figures that has no other purpose in the entire game. They don't have a set price. You give the trade persons a set number of shells. With the more shells you put in, the greater chance of getting a new figure, with that number increasing with every new figure that you obtain. The bare minimum amount of shells that you will need to get all 130 is well over 3,000, which forces you to use another strategy where you don't use as many shells, which also has less of a chance of giving you a new figure for maximum efficiency and shell conservation at the cost of more time wasted. And trading takes 5 million years since you have to wade through a ton of useless dialogue, put in the amount of shells you want to trade, watch the figure slowly appear so you can see which one you got, then wade through another set of useless dialogue. 130 times bare minimum. Each trade takes roughly 20 seconds, meaning that you will spend 45 minutes doing literally nothing other than spamming through dialogue prompts, assuming that you have the perfect luck every single time. And nobody on the dev team saw this as an issue. It's not like it's just a dumb little side thing that you can do like the figures in the Wind Waker. They locked a mother freaking hard piece behind this, which causes me to uncontrollably weep. Why in the world would they lock this behind such a stupid waste of time? I don't understand. It frustrates me to no end. There's this really good video by Mr. Dr. Boy that I'll link everywhere that goes into even more about how unbelievably stupid the system is. Go give it a watch when you're done here. And I know what you're thinking, but you can just ignore them. And yeah, that's true. But that's also like saying that you can just play Majora's Mask without doing any of the side quests, since the entire reward system is built around these two awful systems. For as much as I love Majora's Mask, it has easily the worst main quest in the entire series in terms of gameplay. What saves the game are its brilliant dungeons, its simple yet emotionally gripping story, and the side quests. The game not only takes its time to make you care about the residents of Termina and want to help them, but the gameplay of a lot of the quests is fun. Defending Romani Ranch from the aliens and protecting the cart as it transports milk to the bar, the entire Couple's Mask side quest, which is still to this day the best quest in the entire series. And the list of incredible quests goes on. It's worthwhile and fun to engage with the side activities in Majora, as opposed to Minish Cap, where these two systems basically just take away a lot of what made exploration in these games fun before and after it. They replace fun secrets and dungeon rewards and interesting side content with what is essentially the same action that you do 100 times. They aren't interesting enough to have their existence justified, and they sure as heck do not improve the game in any way. I know that I've been really negative up to this point in the video, but I really wanted to get the most negative stuff out of the way first. From here on out, I'm not going to be nearly as harsh toward the game. In fact, I'll even talk about a couple of the things that I think the game does well, believe it or not. So let's get into that. The overworld of the Minish Cap is quite small. You can walk from one end to the other in about 5 minutes, in fact. Despite this, however, the game still manages to get decent usage out of that map. Ocarina has a far larger map, but outside of a select few pockets, the world feels overly large. And unlike Majora, which likewise has a smaller map, I do think that the general gameplay in these areas are a bit more engaging than what the mountain, the bay, or the valley had to offer. Outside of Hyrule Field, these sections almost feel like a precursor to Skyward Sword's approach to world design. These little dungeon-esque challenges that lead into an actual full-on dungeon. This isn't surprising, of course, considering that both games share the same director. That being said, I do prefer how Skyward Sword handled it. Those challenges are a lot more fun and are more intricately designed than here, the only real trade-off being the segmented nature of it all. But I still think that Minish Cap does a decent job with what it has. I suppose it's not really fair to compare the two games in this department, given how their design approach differs. Skyward Sword is more so about adapting dungeon design into the overworld, and the 3 different areas feel like more open dungeons. While in the Minish Cap, it's more focused on making progressing through these areas more obscure. I'm not the biggest fan of locking the only meaningful and fun exploration behind the main quest, though I am glad it's here to some extent. The lead up to the Cave of Flames has you needing to find a Deku Scrub, which is hidden behind a subtly telegraphed wall, which is only accessible after you find mineral water, thus allowing you to climb Mount Krennel. The lead up to the Fortress of Winds has you zigzagging your way through the forest on a winding path as you slowly make your way to the ruins that lead to the dungeon. The Temple of Droplets has you sneaking through a town, acting as a much more interesting preamble to the dungeon itself. And the same could be said of the other two dungeons. The first one is really the only one that doesn't have that build up, though it's not a problem since it is the first one in the game. If this is where it stopped, then I would probably be a little more positive towards the game as a whole, though when we talk about progression and how it factors into it, it once again baffles me. The game is fairly simple to figure out, but progression becomes needlessly complicated by forcing you to activate ultra-specific progression triggers. Like, if you know that you need the Pegasus boots in order to cross a swamp, you'll only be allowed to get them if you go to cross the swamp first. Or if you know that you need to access the library, it only opens when you talk to a specific Minish in Lake Hylia. Running around trying to figure out how to progress isn't anything new for me. I am a notoriously blind moron when it comes to this stuff. But stuff like this only serves to frustrate me because it feels more like the game is arbitrarily holding me back for no real reason. It almost feels like it's there to punish people who already know what to do, since more inexperienced people are more likely to activate these triggers, since they'll talk to NPCs for hints and try to cross the swamp. If you already know what to do though, you probably aren't going to do that until much later, only to find that you were right from the beginning. Back to positives though, the Minish Cap features a variety of interesting items, most of which aren't that developed, but it's not like that's a problem exclusive to this entry. I'll talk about it more in the next paragraph though. The central mechanic of the game is shrinking down to the size of a Minish. Visually speaking, the only real difference is that the size of Link's sprite changes outside of a few specific screens and in the Minish houses. In terms of gameplay, however, it completely recontextualized the entire surrounding area. There are obstacles that can easily be walked over when bigger that serve as roadblocks when smaller. The best parts of this game are solving the navigational puzzles that arise from figuring out where to shrink to get to new areas, and then how to get to those areas afterward. It serves as a pretty solid way of making progress even more complicated, even if it doesn't go as far as something like Oracle of Ages. As mentioned briefly in the previous paragraph, the items in the game are interesting, however they're underdeveloped. Other Zeldas don't utilize their items to a super good extent either, but it's especially painful in the Minish Cap's case given that A, the previous 3 2D games all had phenomenal use cases for their items, each one felt meaningful and important in a way that isn't often captured in Zelda games, and B, the items are some of the most unique in the series, though that doesn't necessarily mean that they're fun to use. The Gust Jar, for instance, allows you to move lily pads, grab faraway mushrooms to launch yourself, and clearing out obstacles. But not only is it not used that much, it gets really repetitive since they never try to spice things up later. At least with something like Twilight Princess, which doesn't utilize all of its items super well. It does use them in ways that don't get stale after a while. The Kanapachi is used to flip stuff over, but it's generally just so that you can access something to shrink you rather than literally anything else. The Mole Mitts are the only real item that isn't upsetting to use, though it's a bit too much of a key for a specific kind of lock in a way that most items don't really feel like. It's always been a staple of the series, before Breath of the Wild that is, that some areas are locked behind items that you need in order to progress, similar to a Metroidvania, though in general never feels like a full-on Metroidvania like these do. Maybe the fact that Skyward Sword has an evolution of some of these ideas has tainted my view. The Gust Bellows is a lot more fun to use, the mitts are used in a more interesting way than just pressing a button in front of something to make it disappear. To be fair though, Rock's Cape and the Pegasus boots are just as good as ever, so it's not like I can be that critical of Minish Cap in this regard. Perhaps I was being a little mean to the game in regards to the items. While they aren't perfect, they are quite refreshing and make the game a bit more interesting. Besides, the overworld is pretty decent, outside of its frustrating progression triggers. Now onto the mixed bag that is the dungeons in this game. Minish Cap might just have the most fluctuation in quality of any game in the series when it comes to the dungeons. On the one hand, half of them are fairly bland and don't really offer much that Zelda hasn't done before, but then the other half are actually pretty dang solid and enjoyable. Deepwood Shrine has a cool gimmick in the form of this barrel that you need to rotate. Almost makes me upset that this is used in the first dungeon because I think the concept has potential for a tricky progression, but I digress. I think that the flow of the dungeon is pretty good, with you having to burn the vines that hold the barrel in place before you can finally rotate it and access other parts of the dungeon. It's a fairly solid opening dungeon. Cave of Flames doesn't really offer anything new that Zelda hasn't already done, but infinitely better. There's these sections with the Gust of Wind you need to use to traverse the area, and the depth perception is absolutely abysmal, so it's not fun in the slightest. The minecart stuff is fun, but it's also something that the Oracle games did just as well, so it's hard to not be a little miffed when I see them used again in this one with little to no new elements to keep it fresh. The only thing that I can really think that it has going for it is better utilization of being Minish size in the dungeons than the previous dungeon, but later dungeons use this concept much better, so it's not like it's something that I can give a lot of credit for. Fortress of Winds is another dungeon that's actually somewhat fun, with it being a bit more open in how you progress through it. There's a lot of these dirt hill things that you need to use the mole mist to clear, and it opens up the dungeon to a pretty massive extent. There's also some actual choice in how you open doors. There's some thinking about the layout of the dungeon as a whole, with you seeing this key fall down a hole, requiring you to go to that spot a floor below later on. This macro level stuff is the strongest aspect of the dungeon, because I find the individual micro level puzzles here a bit lacking. It's something that I can excuse with the other two since they are the first two dungeons in the game, but at this point it is a little disappointing how breezy it is to complete. The only thing that required effort from my monkey brain was the macro related elements. It's enough for me to say that I enjoy it as a whole, but I prefer when a dungeon excels at both elements. The Water Temple, Lakebed Temple, Sand Ship, Eagle's Tower, basically every dungeon from Oracle of Ages and Majora's Mask, all of these not only balance the macro level challenge of figuring the dungeon out as a whole, but they also have fantastic individual puzzles as well. This is why I consider them to be my favorite in the series, and it's a little unfortunate that Minish Cap fumbles it a little here. Temple of Droplets, aside from one of the most atmospheric and all-around great pieces of dungeon music in the series, is once again kinda just blah. There's some fun elements here, like these block pushing puzzles on ice that I've always really liked, or getting the boss key right at the start, with the main goal actually being to melt a frozen Octorok with a light from above, but I feel like the linear structure of the dungeon means that this idea isn't explored as thoroughly as it might have been. You can only take one central predetermined path. The puzzles on this path are mildly tricky, but after a couple of minutes I've solved them and already moved on to the next room. It reuses a couple of bosses from earlier in the game as mini bosses. That sure is something that it does, and it feels kinda lazy. The changes are superfluous at best. Shooting electricity or contending with ice physics aren't enough to make it feel like a justified rematch. The lily pads are somewhat annoying to use, and it asks you to use them quite a bit. I don't really know what else I can say. It's mostly just a disappointment with how incredible the music is. Palace of Winds is reminiscent of the approach to dungeons that Oracle of Seasons had, and for the most part I actually quite enjoy this one. It utilizes Rock's Cape fairly well, the combat encounters are actually kind of fun here, the puzzles are moderately better than what was previously offered in the game. This being the penultimate dungeon might have something to do with it, but I feel like this one they made the process of following the progression path that was laid out before you equally as fun as trying to figure out how to progress. It's not nearly as enjoyable for me personally. I will always prefer trying to figure out how to progress through the dungeon rather than just following a predetermined path. If the other dungeons in this game made linear progression as fun as it is here, then I wouldn't be nearly as hard on those dungeons, because this one proves that it is possible to make an engaging experience without focusing on the macro level challenge. It's just that none of the other ones match the level of this one. Dark Hyrule Castle is a fairly solid final dungeon. The puzzles are actually somewhat engaging, with the ones involving your clones being particularly fun to fight. Oh yeah, there are parts in this game that allow you to clone yourself. Trust me, while it's an interesting idea, they don't really do much with it outside of this dungeon and a couple of the bosses. The video is almost over, and I can almost guarantee that you weren't confused when I didn't mention it earlier. That is how underbaked it is. Anyway, the combat is fun, specifically when taking on the Dark Nuts. It uses the dungeon items in interesting ways. It's a gauntlet of obstacles, and it ends the game on a really strong note. The atmosphere is also incredible, the fantastic remix of the theme from Link to the Past, the purple clouds and color palette, it's such a cool vibe. I don't have that much to say on it otherwise, just a good way to end the dungeons in this game. Much like the dungeons, half of the bosses in this game are great, while the other half are quite pitiful. The first boss in the game's gimmick is that it's a regular overworld enemy that is now huge. The novelty wears off fairly quickly when you realize how pathetically easy he is. All you need to do is just use the Gust Jar and you'll be set. There's no challenge here at all. Glee Rock is more tedious than anything else. You need to avoid its attacks consisting of fireballs, lighting a portion of the arena on fire, breathing fire straight up, with you needing to use the cane Apache to flip his shell over to damage him. I can see the potential of this fight where it's fun, but as it is, it mostly feels kinda boring and even a little tedious. I don't really have a good reason for not liking him here, I just don't. Mawzal makes pretty good use of the size shrinking mechanic, with you needing to stun him with arrows while normal size and then climbing inside to damage him. It's a really fun fight, as most of the hand-based fights in Zelda are. I do wish the shrinking was a bit more substantial here, but the extent that it is used to is still fine enough. The progression between each of the phases is also pretty good and natural. Overall, a really good boss. Big Octorok is whatever, you just need to hit the boulders he shoots at you back at him, and then burn his tail. Again, his main selling point is that he's a regular enemy that is now big because you are small. It's a fun idea for bosses, but they don't really do enough interesting things with that idea. It's still a decent fight, but it's still not great. Georg is a fantastic boss, with you needing to use Rock's cape and the clone mechanic to jump from flying manta rays and trying to line yourself up so that you can attack all of the eyes at the same time before all your clones disappear. It's an incredibly fun and engaging fight that makes good use of an otherwise underdeveloped mechanic. Vaati is also a really good boss. The first phase has you needing to destroy the eyes that surround him while he teleports around the screen, sending a flurry of attacks your way as you wait for the eye on his stomach to open so that you can slash at it with your sword. The second phase has you shooting at his eyes with arrows while you avoid the purple spikes he shoots out at you. Then you need to clone yourself in the pattern of the remaining undamaged eyes. As the phase goes on, he gets more aggressive with his attacks and he becomes more difficult to damage as you repeat the process. The final phase of the fight sees you first needing to lure his arms over to use the Cane of Pachi on them so you can shrink and attack him from the inside. It's not that big of an evolution of the idea presented earlier, but the way in which you stun him is at least different enough to prevent me from being too bothered by that. Once his arms are taken care of, he'll chug a bunch of Red Bull and grow wings, flying around the arena shooting balls of electricity at you, with you needing to use your clones to play energy tennis with him. Overall, Vaati is hands down the strongest fight in the game. He makes good use of the mechanics and offers a fair challenge. It's an incredibly strong way to end out what I ultimately think is a mediocre game. Considering that this is likely to be the last negatively slanted Zelda video I make until I finally get to play the CDI games, I suppose I'll ask a simple question. What do people see in the Minish Cap that I don't? What is it about Vaati as an antagonist that works for people, whereas I see him as boring with poorly thought out motivations? What does the game have that I'm not seeing? It's often heralded as the most underrated Zelda title, so often that I feel as though its praises are being sung too high. Its highs are undeniably high, but its lows are abysmal. The Kinstone system and Mysterious Shells are horrid and replace compelling reward systems, which essentially locks off any meaningful or satisfying exploration. The dungeons and bosses are a mixed bag of quality. Some are great, but others are bland. The Overworld can be fun to explore, but its arbitrary progression triggers make what should have been a simple adventure overly complicated. These are my issues with the game, and others either don't have as big a problem with them as I do, or just straight up don't think that they are issues, which is a completely valid stance to take. What I look for in a dungeon isn't on display here, but what I look for is complicated level design with satisfying puzzles, and that's something that a lot of people would disagree on. I'm not here to rain on anyone's parade. If you think that Minish Cap is an underrated masterpiece, then more power to you. You shouldn't let some random 18-year-old on the internet tell you what you should or should not be allowed to like. As for me, this game only ever makes me wish that its mechanics and ideas were in a game that was more suited for me, and sadly that day will probably never come.